Good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's workshop on prototype designing and development, which is primarily aimed at breaking down the essential steps of prototype idea generation and designing for early stage founders and students building on the product idea. It is extremely important to have a good prototype in hand before, scaling up further, not only for drawing valuable feedback from your customers, but also for visualizing and comprehending your product's function, shortcomings, market value better. This in turn is going to save you a lot of time, money, and effort that goes into product building. So yeah, it is clearly evident that a well-designed prototype is very valuable to iterate early and steer the product building in right direction. And to help us better understand how this can be done, we have Pranav from Innovation Garage as a speaker for today's session. I would like to request Pranav to take off from here.
Thank you, Kirti. Like Kirti told, our topic for today's discussion would be prototype development and design. To be very fair, I am probably the most ineligible person to be talking about this, but then because you all couldn't find anybody better, here we are. Let's get straight into it. This is the agenda for today, right? We'll be covering these topics broadly on. Now, Pelito will talk about how the product development process occurs generally in a startup, what are the phases that are involved, and where does prototyping fall into that timeline. And then we'll dig a little bit into what prototyping actually is. And after this slide or after this point, you might have a doubt thinking that POC would be fairly similar to what a prototype is, and prototype is again fairly similar to what an MVP is. So where does the differentiation occur and which one should you focus on more? And then we'll talk about, once at this point, hopefully we're clear about what a prototype is, we'll talk about, the prototyping cycle, and then we'll eventually touch upon product development as well. So, talking about startup development phases, this is broadly what happens, right? No, mostly we talk about 0 to 1 phase, but we forget about the rest of the phases. There is a very large pre-startup phase, which ideally involves ideation and conceptualizing what your idea is about and what target segment are you targeting and what problem you're going after. And once you're clear with that, you go on to build your MVP and then look for a PMF. And then if you do find a PMF, you scale and then you grow your company, right? Now, in all of these processes, where does prototyping fall? It falls somewhere right here, right? It's before MVP, but then it's after conceptualizing what you want to do. So think of it this way. You get an idea, you conceptualize on what the idea is, like you dig deeper into it, you frame a proper problem statement, you find a target audience that needs the product you're building, and then you build something called as a proof of concept, and then you build a prototype, and then you build an MVP, then you find PMF, scale, and whatnot. So essentially, now that we know where prototyping occurs in the timeline of an ideal startup journey, we can dig deeper into what prototyping actually is. I don't think I have to explain a lot. Prototyping is a very generic term and it's quite self-explanatory. But for this exercise, let's go through what the proper definition is, right? As you might have guessed, prototyping is a very integral step in product design and development, more so in product design. I also would like to establish this distinction between hardware products and software products. The definition of prototyping in hardware and software products is very different. And for this discussion, at least, we will mostly be focusing on software products because that's the kind of ideas we mostly deal with at Innovation Garage. But even to slightly touch upon what hardware prototyping takes, you might have guessed hardware prototyping can involve anything from a basic 3D print to actually manufacturing a full-scale product, right? So it's a quite tiresome and elaborate process, while software prototyping is much more simple and it's more UX and design based. So a prototype is essentially a sample of your product, which you would use to build or test your concept and start the process of actually a product development in your startup, right? The goal of a prototype is to evaluate your idea. Now, if you followed along so far, in point two, I mentioned prototype is a sample built to test your concept. That sounds like a proof of concept. How is it different from prototype? And in point three, I mentioned the goal of a prototype is to evaluate your idea. That sounds like a minimum viable product, right? That sounds like an MVP. Now, how does prototype differ from that? So that's where I think I would like to base the core of this discussion here. What is the difference between POC? By POC, I mean proof of concept. And what's the difference between POC, prototype, and an MVP? Let's go through each one of them individually, right? Very briefly. Yeah, I wouldn't like to drag this a lot, but proof of concept is when you technologically see if the idea you're working on or the technology you're working on is viable or not. You test the capability of yourself doing it and generally the capability of technology to be that worthwhile. Let's take an example, right? Let's say you're building all of these exercises, so you're doing all of these processes for an app like Uber. So a POC would be you testing out the core technology behind it. There is no product so far. There are no customers, there are no investors. It's just you trying to test the technology of uh, a two-sided marketplace to see if it genuinely works. Now, a lot of startups usually run on established principles, right? It's either a two-sided marketplace, it's an aggregator marketplace, it's a social media app. So in a lot of these cases, the technology isn't new. So in that case, a POC doesn't make sense. But in a lot of hardware startups, especially, POC is extremely important because hardware startups and deep tech startups, your technology is your USP, right? Your use case is not your USP. In a marketplace kind of ecosystem or a social media kind of app, your use case or your distribution is your USP. Your technology isn't. Your technology is very replicable. But in a deep tech startup, what differentiates you is your core technology, right? In this case, having a full-blown POC is extremely important, where you test out, hey, this you know uh, long far short you're talking about, is it actually viable to build? Is it actually viable to build out the technology in a certain cost or within the manpower you have and whatnot? Talking about MVP, let's come to prototype in the last, because that kind of lies in between MVP and POC. Let's talk about MVP, right? MVP is when you have a fairly full-blown product that you can kind of test with users. So in this case, unlike POC, there is an actual product. POC is just a piece of technology that users cannot interact with. MVP is a full-blown product which your users can interact and you can potentially generate revenue from also. But then, how does MVP differ from a full-scale product? It differs in terms of features. MVP is a very vague term. An MVP for different companies mean different things. For a company A, an MVP, all the features that they're including in MVP might be too high scale for a company B who's just including one or two features in their MVP, right? So a lot of jargon. I understand that. Essentially, if I have to simplify all of this, a POC is essentially just the core technology of your product. An MVP is the first version with just one, two core features of what you're offering, and prototype lies in between. Now, like I told, prototype means different things for hardware and software startups. Talking about software startups, prototype generally deals with something on the design or the front end part, right? So what essentially happens is, hey, first you do a technology check, saying you build a POC, you check if you are able to build what you're claiming to build. Second is you build out a flow. By flow, I mean a user flow where a prototype again has multiple stages in itself. It can be from a paper wireframe to a small low fidelity wireframe to a high fidelity wireframe on something like Figma or Adobe XD, right? So you build out a flow saying this is where the user enters my app. This is the kind of buttons or this is the kind of options he'll be shown. If he clicks on this, this happens. If he clicks on this happens. And you have the whole map kind of structure ready, right? And then you test that out. Now, until now in POC, you usually don't involve customers. You're usually testing like the backend or the technology aspect of it. Now, when you start prototyping, this is where the customer and the feedback loop comes in. It's essential to note that once the POC phase ends, you will have to do multiple iterations, multiple sprints of these user feedback loops to understand that you're going on the right path. So a prototype is essentially, let's for the sake of this example, let's say it's a Figma prototype, right? By which I mean you have all the screens designed on your Figma, and you're going around showing it to your users, saying, "Hey, what do you think of this? Would you pay for a service like this?" And you have to understand that even until the prototype phase, you do not actually have a product. It is at the MVP stage that the product actually starts to, take shape. So that is the rough distinguishment between what a POC is, what a prototype is, and what an MVP is. Uh, Now that we have a decentish idea on what a prototype is, let's see uh, what is the cycle of building a prototype, right? I understand that in startups most of this thing happens by intuition and there isn't a framework that you can follow, but these are the kind of basic thumb rules that you can keep in mind, that you can roughly follow. That these are the kind of things that will help you navigate when you're stuck. So you start with an initial investigation, right? Which is arriving at your idea or arriving at your aha moment, right? Arriving at your eureka moment where you identify a void in the market, you come up with a problem statement, and you come up with a solution, and you think that you have something substantial that you can offer and that the market needs. Then you review it. You go through requirements. Now, in the product management lingo, you draft something called as a product requirement document, but which is essentially a document containing all of the features that you would build, at least in this prototype, right? You would list out all the requirements. You would do something called as a system design. By system design, I mean, again, this if you already have a POC, it becomes way easier to do system design, because system design is kind of uh, a document or a design which outlines all of the system requirements that you would be implementing in your technology. Now, like I said, if yours is a e-commerce, or if yours is a startup, software startup that derives its USP from distribution and not core technology, doing system design is kind of easy, and you can kind of skip past this phase. But if you are a deep tech startup, or if you're a hardware startup, this is probably the most crucial step, right? This is where you kind of outline how the individual system, or how the individual components in your technology talk to each other, and how the technology, in essence, in outline, how it works. So right after system design, I think it's not included here. I mean, system design is a more technical thing. You do something called as UI or UX design, and then you code the whole thing. Then you go for a user testing, you review, and then you repeat this process. Usually, prototyping is not a single cycle process. You have to do it 2-3 times. It's a very iterative process, because every time you go for testing, every time you take a review, you will find flaws, right? But then, yeah, does it mean that you have to go through this cycle infinitely? Yes, and by which I mean at some point you have to implement it and take it out to the public, right? So what you do is uh, you go out of your closed beta loop and release it to the public, and then you now have a larger audience that's giving you feedback, and now you don't technically rely on first hand review, you rely more on numbers. uh, I've used a little bit of jargon in the last sentence. I think it's not necessary to simplify it. uh, what I mean is, in the testing phase in a prototype cycle, you don't release the product out to the public. You give it to a closed group of people. It's usually called closed beta, because you're testing the beta of your product. It's not the alpha yet. The full scale product isn't ready yet. So you get first-hand review, right? You get first-hand criticism saying, "Hey, I don't like the color of this button, or I don't think it's intuitive for me to do this, or I don't, or I think that it doing this action goes against my intuitional customer behavior," right? So you go through all of those requirements, and by the end of 2-3 cycles, you clear off all the major concerns, because you're getting first-hand criticism. You can get, you can ask cross questions, you can ask clarifying questions, and you get rid of all the major problems or the major bugs, or you kind of also test if there's an actual void in the market that you were imagining, and if there's an actual scope for your company to exist. After that, you go, you release the so-called final version to the public, and now you can still run closed beta groups, but at this point, it's very hard for you to go out in the public and talk to each customer, right? So at this point, you kind of rely on numbers, on analytics to see where the drop-off rate is occurring, at which screen people are not doing an action that you intended them to do, right? So, and then you maintain your system, and then the cycle continues, right? It's never ending. It's a perennial loop of testing and designing, reviewing, and then going back to requirements. This is also the process you follow if you're developing a new feature. Let's say you do have an alpha app that's doing quite well, and you develop a new feature, a new tag along. This is the same system that you will be following. Uh, yes. So let's go back to the initial chart that we saw, right? This is the startup development phase. So now we've seen what a prototype development is and where does it fall in the whole timeline. After this is the MVP stage and the product market stage and the scale stage. Ideally, if you've attended the last few sessions, we spoke about ideation, conceptualizing, and drawing out a business model. And this falls right. This piece falls right after that, and eventually we will be doing more sessions on how to build an MVP, how to scale, how to gain PMF, etc. So yeah, that was all from my side. I'd be happy to take if you have any questions.
All right, assuming that there are no more questions, we can end the session here. First of all, thank you, Pranav, for sharing such wonderful insights on everything that one needs to know about prototype or how it differs from POC and MVP, and how can one go about designing and developing it, especially during the early stages of startup building. Now that we had a workshop on prototyping, I hope participants got a decent understanding on stages and whole cycle of going from concept to product. So that being said, thank you everyone for joining us today. We can end the session here. Thank you once again.